Hello, this is Katie Buttstein, your Bio 110 instructor. Today we're going to start the module on human anatomy and physiology. So this is a brief overview of human A&P, and the first part of the notes is going to start with some directional terms, feedback systems, and go through some of the basics that you need to know to understand human anatomy and physiology. The second part of the notes is going to go through the systems, so each system of the body. So anatomy, you always hear human anatomy and physiology or anatomy and physiology. You hear two words of it, but what do they really mean? Anatomy is the study of the structure of the body and the body parts. And physiology is a study of the function of the body and the body parts. So for example, if you are going to be studying maybe the anatomy of the stomach, you're going to look at the parts of it, like the cardia, the top of it, the body of the stomach, maybe the pylorus of the stomach, the different layers of the stomach wall, things like that. So that is the structure, is anatomy. Physiology is how something works. So the physiology is the function of the body or body part. And by the way, they both have an F sound, physiology and function, even though physiology starts with the PH. So as far as the stomach, you might look at how does the stomach work. And you might think about or learn about the stomach producing hydrochloric acid and pepsin. And pepsin breaking down, pepsin breaking down proteins, things like that. So how it works would be physiology. Homeostasis is the ability of the body to maintain a stable internal condition despite changes in the external environment. So you're going to be looking at all of the different conditions in the body and to try to have them stable, and that is homeostasis. For example, we are warm-blooded. So whether we're outside and it's 30 degrees out or 95 degrees out, our internal body temperature is supposed to stay the same. If it gets too high, our enzymes will unravel. If it gets too low, everything will freeze. So we're about 98.6, right? Anyway, so that is homeostasis, the ability of the body to maintain stable internal conditions despite changes in the external environment. Another example is blood glucose. And we'll look at that, but the blood glucose, whether we just eat something or haven't eaten for a long time, should stay around 90 or 100 milligrams per milliliter. Blood oxygen. You know, you go to the doctor, they measure your blood oxygen, put the little thing on your finger, and it's usually around the upper 90s. So blood pressure 120 over 80, and sometimes it's lower, sometimes it's higher, but homeostasis is maintaining stable internal conditions despite changes in the external environment. And when something like this is not being maintained at a stable level, or if it's too high or too low, then that is a disease state. So the body uses feedback systems to maintain homeostasis. And by the way, notice this word stasis, stable, homea, same, so same stable conditions. So feedback control may be positive or negative, and most of the homeostatic control systems are negative feedback systems. So a negative feedback system is a process in which the body senses a change and activates mechanisms that negate or reverse it. So you can remember this negative, it negates or reverses it. So there's like a minus, it changes and the response is opposite the condition that causes it. So here's a good example. So here's your blood glucose level. They should stay around 90 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood. And after you eat, depending on what you eat too, your blood glucose level will rise. The pancreas will release insulin, And then what the insulin does is it causes the liver and body cells to take up some of the glucose that's in the blood and make it into glycogen and store it for later. So then your blood glucose level goes back to where it's supposed to be. And you know, if maybe there's a problem with maintaining these level glucose, homeostasis for glucose levels, someone might have diabetes. So here, what could happen is your blood glucose could drop below a certain set point. And if that happens, your blood glucose level is low, your pancreas releases a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon causes the liver to break down glycogen back into glucose, and that raises your blood glucose back to this set point. So one thing that I like to think about with negative feedback is I like to think about your thermostat. And here in Maine, we always think about in the winter when it gets too cold. So when it gets too cold, your thermostat senses that and it causes your furnace to turn on, which heats up the house back to a certain temperature. So that is negative feedback because your stimulus was cold and your response was to warm it back up. That's opposite of cold until it is at this certain level. Whereas I grew up in Houston and it's very hot there. So there when it got too hot, then what would happen is your thermostat would kick on and it would turn on your air conditioner, which would put out cold air until it hit the right temperature, and then that would stop. But that's negative feedback. Here is positive feedback, a positive feedback system. So here you have a process in which a physiological change leads to an even greater change in the same direction. So this would be like if it got really hot, so that, some sensor picked it up and it made it get hotter, and then it made it get hotter. So that doesn't work with body temp. But here's an example where you do have a positive feedback system. This is oxytocin produced during childbirth. Oxytocin is a hormone that has a lot of different functions, but here is the one in childbirth. So what's going to happen here is the baby is going to hit its head against the mother's cervix. That's going to cause the cervix to stretch, and that's going to cause nerve impulses from the cervix to go to the brain, and that stimulates the pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. Then oxytocin goes into the bloodstream to the uterus, and it stimulates the muscles in the uterus to have more contractions to push the head against the cervix more, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more uterine contractions, which causes the head to be pushed against the cervix, and then more stretching and more oxytocin and more stretching and more oxytocin and more stretching. So it's a positive feedback system. It's causing more and more and more oxytocin, and then more and more and more uterine contractions until finally the baby comes out of there, and that would be birth. So here's another example of a positive feedback mechanism, and that's the formation of platelet plugs. So platelets are little fragments of these cells called megakaryocytes, but they're little pieces of cells. And so here's what happens. Anytime you have a bleeding incident occur, then it's because you have a blood vessel breaks or tears. So then the blood is coming out of it, because all of our blood is in blood vessels. It's not just floating around us in a big cavity or sac or something. So here it is, the blood vessel has a tear, and then what's going to happen is platelets are going to start to stick to the site of the tear. Then they are going to release chemicals that attract more platelets. So then more platelets stick there, and they release more chemicals that attract more platelets, and more chemicals, more platelets, more and more and more and more, until you have this platelet plug is formed, which closes up that leak. So that is another positive feedback mechanism. Almost all of the feedback mechanisms that you hear about are negative feedback mechanisms, except for those two, oxytocin in childbirth and also platelet plug formation. But here you can see, does this look like negative or positive? So this is body temperature. Here is what's happened, and here's the response. So the body temperature increases, it's too hot, so it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, so plus temperature. And then there's sweat going on, there's blood vessels near the surface dilating, which makes someone look red. And the sweat has evaporative cooling, which takes off energy, which cools someone off. So that lowers the body temp. So here's the stimulus is increase in temp. The response is decrease in temp. So that is opposite, and that is a negative feedback loop. And here, I think I already mentioned this, when the body gets really cold, you shiver. The shivering is caused by muscles contracting. Also, you get the little goosebumps, which are little tiny muscles in the skin attached to hairs that contract. But muscles contracting produces heat, and that increases the body temperature. So decrease in body temp causes responses that increase body temp. So that's opposite. So body temperature would be a negative, or body temperature control is a negative feedback system. So when people take human anatomy and physiology, after a few weeks, then a lot of times they'll say, well, this is like a foreign language. Well, what you really need to do with this anatomy and physiology is make sure that you know these anatomical words in anatomical position, directional terms, because you'll be using them throughout A&P. So we just have a 2-week module, but it's still very important to learn them. So for anatomical position, the body is erect, which means just standing straight up. It's the whole body standing up, just not a part of it. Okay, the feet are flat on the floor, okay, and then they're slightly apart and facing forward, so your toes face forward, your heels face back, and then your head and your palms are facing forward. So you're facing front, your head's not turned, and so forth. This is important because if you try to explain where something is in the body, then the body's going to be in this position. And if you're thinking of it with your palms backwards or your hands up over your head, then you're not going to explain where that is. For example, you might say the head is superior to the feet. All that means is the head is above the feet. Or you might say the ears are lateral to the nose. And that would mean the ears are out toward the side compared to the nose, whereas the nose is medial to the ears. So here are some of the directional terms. Superior means above, inferior means below or toward the floor. And again, well, we'll look at this later, let's see. Ventral means, or anterior means toward the front. So it's different with animals that stand on all four than us, so those are a little bit different, but we're just going to look at people. So if you say something like your navel is anterior or ventral to your spinal column, that means it's going to be toward the belly. Dorsal or posterior is toward the back. So then you might say that your spinal column is dorsal to the navel. Okay, so it's toward the back. So medial means toward the midline of the body. So here's the midline right here. So medial, you might say your heart is medial to the lungs. Okay, because the lungs are on the side, the heart's in the middle. Lateral means away from the midline of the body. So the lungs are lateral to the heart. Proximal and distal. You use proximal and distal when you're looking at things on limbs, so on, or appendages, the arms or the legs. And proximal usually means like in close proximity. So that is closer to the point of attachment to the trunk. So on the arm, it means closer to the shoulder, and the leg, it means closer to the hip. So an example would be the elbow is proximal to the wrist. because the elbow is closer to the shoulder or the point of attachment than the wrist is. Or here you might say the knee is proximal to the toes. The ankle is proximal to the toes. So distal is farther from the point of attachment to the trunk. So it's more distant is distal. Proximal, closer proximity. Distal is more distant. So the ankle is distal to the knee because you're comparing the ankle and the knee. Now you might want to use superior and inferior on this because it is up and down, but on the limbs it's always proximal and distal. Okay? And then here your fingers are distal to your wrist, but your wrist is going to be proximal to your fingers. So when you're using these, you're usually comparing two parts of the body. Superficial or external is closer to the body surface, and deep or internal is farther from the body surface. So it's more into the body. By the way, notice most of these come in pairs, these words, and they need the opposite. So superficial, if you say a person's really superficial, then you're saying, you know, they're just what you see on the surface, right? But here, the skin is superficial to the muscles, and the muscles are deep to the skin because they're further inside the body than the skin. So for body regions, there's two major regions. The axial region consists of the head, the neck, and the trunk. And if you look at that, they're on the axis of the body. I think of like you have the pole, the north and the south pole with the axis between it. So just picture an axis between here. I always picture a little like skeleton ornament or something. They actually sell them, little like skeleton ornaments with a little hook on it, but there's the axis. And that's going to be the head, so your skull if you're looking at the skeleton, your neck, and then the trunk. And that includes your whole vertebral column and your sacrum, including your sacrum and coccyx tailbone. The appendicular region consists of the appendages, which are arms and legs, and the girdles that hold them there, if you're talking at the skeleton. So the arms, and then here you're looking at the skeleton, so it's going to include the pectoral girdle or shoulder girdle. So you have the clavicle and scapula, and then the arms. And when you look at, and that's appendicular because the arms are appendages. Here, this one actually, they're done green on it. And then here for the leg, the lower limbs are the legs. So the appendicular region includes the legs and the pelvic girdle, which are the hip bones. So these two big bones, the coxal bones, which form the pelvic girdle, they're part of the appendicular region. There's cavities in the body. Now remember, dorsal means toward the back compared to ventral, which is toward the belly, so dorsal or posterior. Anyway, I think of the dorsal fin of a fish to remember that, like shark. If you're older, you might remember Jaws and the sound da-da, da-da. But anyway, the dorsal fin, the shark always has that. So the dorsal body cavity consists of the cranial cavity, which surrounds the brain, and the brain's in it, and then the vertebral cavity, which is going to contain the spinal cord. And you'll notice there's vertebrae which surround the vertebral cavity, and then the spinal cord runs inside of that. So the dorsal body cavity is in the back, and it's made up of these two cavities. Whereas in the front, you're going to have it a ventral body cavity. And so here was the dorsal body cavity on this side. Here is the ventral body cavity. And the ventral body cavity, it's this whole thing here. It consists of the thoracic and the abdominopelvic cavities. So the thoracic cavity is up here, this whole thing here. And then there's a diaphragm, which is a muscular sheet used in breathing that goes between the thoracic cavities and the abdominopelvic cavity. Here's the abdominopelvic cavity here. So here's the diaphragm right here, separating them. And here you can see right below this. And then the thoracic cavity has the mediastinum and the pleural cavities. And I've heard it pronounced mediastinum or mediastinum, but the mediastinum contains the pericardial cavity. Peri means around. Anyone know what cardial would mean? You've heard of maybe a cardiac event. So cardial is heart. So the pericardial cavity contains the heart. And then up here above it has the esophagus and the trachea, and they actually run back behind there. Well, the trachea just runs here and branches, but then the esophagus runs down there. So thoracic cavity contains the mediastinum and the pericardial cavity. And then the two pleural cavities that are also in the thoracic cavities, they contain the lungs. I remember that because you know how plural means more than one of something, like there could be singular or plural. Well, there's two lungs and there's two pleural cavities. And then here it is here, the mediastinum, and here's the heart, and here's the esophagus and trachea, and right here the mediastinum, the whole thing. There's the heart. And then here's the pleural cavities. The heart's in the pericardial cavity. The pleural cavities have the lungs. So the abdominopelvic cavity. Isn't this interesting? It looks like two words, abdomino for abdominal and pelvic for pelvic, right? Well, look, this is actually divided into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And there's really no wall separating them like the diaphragm here. But the abdominal cavity is the superior portion. See, superior, it is above or toward the ceiling compared to the pelvic cavity. So superior portion of the abdominopelvic cavity, it contains the stomach, intestines, spleen, liver, and gallbladder. And then the pelvic cavity is the inferior or lower portion. It contains the urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and the rectum. So the bottom part of the large intestine is the rectum. And then notice someone could here say the pericardial cavity is medial to the pleural cavities. The pleural cavities are lateral to the pericardial cavity. The thoracic cavity is superior to the abdominopelvic cavity. So you can practice your directional terms. Oh, look, this is what we saw already. And look, there's these words here, mid-sagittal view and coronal or frontal view. So all these different words. Another picture. You know, I tend to put a lot of pictures in my presentations because to me, like, I like this one better than some of the other ones, but to me it depends on who's going to look at it. And notice a dotted line for the pelvic cavity, but some people might see one of them better than the other. I also like this because of the bright colors, and you can sit here and on the PowerPoint, the original PowerPoint, you can actually move these. And you know, you could print this page, or you could write and then write them down where they go, or you could copy them and move them somehow if you had the PowerPoint, but I think we all have PDFs. But here, the abdominal cavity, then you can go, well, the abdominal cavity is going to be just this part. The abdominopelvic cavity is this part. So you could move that and label them. The cranial cavity is this part. Dorsal cavity, that part. The diaphragm is this part. So you may want to print out that slide and play with that. And here's the answers. So the next thing we're going to look at are serous membranes. Serous membranes, or serosa, they are double-layered membranes with a thin layer of serous fluid between them. And what serous fluid is a watery, sort of slippery, lubricating fluid in many of the body cavities and between the serous membranes. So the serous fluid is produced and secreted by cells in the serous membranes. And the serous fluid prevents friction between organs and cavity walls. So around these organs, you have a double layered membrane. It's just like if you were to take a water balloon, okay, and then put your fist into it, just like over here, and then you have two layers. You have one layer of balloon, one layer of fluid, and then the serous cavity, and then another layer of balloon. But here it's one layer of serous membrane, serous fluid in the serous cavity, and then you have an outer layer of membrane. There are three major serous membranes: the pericardium, which surrounds the heart. Remember, peri is around, cardium is heart. The pleurae, which surround the lungs. Remember, the lungs are in the pleural cavities because there's two of them, they're plural. Then the peritoneum is in the abdominopelvic cavity. Now you'll notice each one of these, you have the parietal layer is the very outer layer, and then you'll have a cavity is between it that has serous fluid, and then the visceral layer, here is a visceral pericardium, is directly lining the heart. So here you have parietal pleura, then the pleural cavity, and then the visceral pleura directly lines the lungs. And here you have lining the whole wall of the abdominopelvic cavity is going to be the parietal peritoneum. And then surrounding each organ here, and then you'll have the visceral peritoneum. Now this is really important because normally if you didn't have these layers, every time your heart beats, it would be beating and beating and beating, and it would be beating, it sits right here between the lungs, and it would be beating against the lungs. And then your lungs, you would inhale and they'd be inhaling, inflating, and then deflating, inflating, and deflating. And lungs are very delicate. I think by the end of day one, probably the lungs would be completely worn away just from friction rubbing up back and forth against the heart. So it's really important to have the lubrication and to have like between the different organs. Here's another picture of the abdominopelvic cavity with the parietal peritoneum lining the wall of it, and the visceral peritoneum lining the organs. And you can see there's some organs in the pelvic cavity that are beneath the peritoneum. They're not in it. Like here's the uterus and the urinary bladder and the rectum. So here are the levels of structural organizations of living organisms. And I know you've looked at some of these already back when we did background information and chemistry. But atoms, the smallest particle of an element that still retains the characteristics of those elements, atoms can join together and form molecules. And then molecules can form together. They can actually form macromolecules if you want to put that here. But then here's organelles, which are formed from molecules, and they're like little organs in the cells. Each organelle does a little jobs, and I know you've learned about those, some of them. This one's the mitochondria. And the next level of organization is the cells. So here you're going from smallest and least complex to largest and most complex. But here is a smooth muscle cell. So it's going to have organelles in it, like the nucleus, the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, the rough and smooth ER. But here is a tissue. And tissues are made up of all the same kind of cell, but a bunch of cells working together to perform one or more functions. And then several different tissues working together will form an organ. So here is a blood vessel, and it's formed by, here's the smooth muscle tissue from here, also connective tissue on the outside and epithelial tissue on the inside. And then several organs will work together, and they will form a system and perform one or more many functions, but they'll all be working together. And this would be the cardiovascular system, which is the heart and blood vessels. That's blood vessels are arteries, veins, and capillaries. And they are all working together to circulate blood throughout the body. And then several organ systems will work together and form an organism. So here is a human being. Now, I know you've learned about some organisms that are made up of just of cells. They don't have tissues, organs, or systems. So like the bacteria that you learned about in microbes, they're unicellular. Each one's made up of one cell. There's some protists, and I know we don't go through protists that much in here, but they're unicellular. But then there's also some organisms that just have cells and tissues, but they don't have organs, systems, and organisms. I believe some of the lower animals you looked at, if you recall, just have tissues. But then pretty quickly they start having organs and organ systems, and then we have all of the levels. And any of the mammals have all of the levels, and reptiles and vertebrates and almost all of the higher animals do, and plants. So the next section we're looking at is on tissues. Tissues are groups of cells that are similar in structure and perform a common or related function. Histology is the study of tissues. There are 4 major tissue types or primary tissue types. Epithelial tissues, these cover or line body surfaces. So the outside of the body, the skin, is epithelial tissues or lining cavities. There's connective tissues. They support, protect, bind, store, transport, and insulate. Muscle tissues move the body and body parts. They also can move substances through the body. And nervous tissue controls the body. So if you think of your brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And here's just an example of each type of tissues. As far as the connective tissue, that's going to be the most variable types of tissues. They're very different, where as nervous tissue, there's only one tissue in this group. So here is just showing where the different tissues are, and they're all throughout the body, but examples. So nervous tissue, the brain, the spinal cord, and nerves. Muscle tissue, you can have, and it contracts to cause movement. So skeletal muscles are attached to bones, so attached to the skeleton. Cardiac muscle is the muscle of the heart. And smooth muscle, that's the muscles in the walls of hollow organs like the digestive tract. Epithelial tissue forms boundaries, protects, secretes, absorbs, and filters. So lining your digestive tract and other hollow organs, also the skin surface. And then connective tissue, so your bones, tendons, ligaments, fats, all sorts of other tissues in there. Epithelial tissues cover and line surfaces. The functions are protection, absorption, filtration, excretion, and secretion. So the characteristics of epithelial tissues, the cells are tightly packed with little material in between them. So if you think of your skin, the skin cells are packed right next to each other. Whereas if you think of something like blood, which is a connective tissue, then you have the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Then you have all the plasma, the liquid, all between them. But epithelial tissues are tightly packed with little material between them. Epithelial tissue is avascular. A means without and vascular blood supply. So epithelial doesn't have a direct blood supply. The underlying connective tissue will have the blood vessels in it. Epithelial tissue is the most rapidly dividing tissue in the body. So think of your skin as constantly losing cells off the top of the surface of your skin, but then you constantly have new cells being made from the bottom layer of the skin, bottom layer of the epidermis anyway, the outer layer of the skin, pushing those cells up. The classification of epithelial tissue is based on cell shape and arrangement, cell arrangement, and we'll look at those in a minute. But epithelium means epithelial tissue. So people get tired of saying epithelial tissue 1,000 times, so they just say epithelium. Now, if you say epithelium tissue, that means epithelial tissue. So either say epithelial tissue or epithelium. So simple squamous epithelium means one layer. That's simple, is one layer. Squamous means flat. And epithelium is epithelial tissue, so one layer of flat cells. This is located in the kidneys, the air sacs of the lungs, capillary walls. It lines the heart and the blood vessels. A major function is diffusion and filtration. So this is the thinnest type of tissues. It's only one layer. It's flat cells, so they're very, very thin. So things can diffuse through them if they're small enough. And if you look at this simple squamous epithelium, this is like looking at floor tiles, so you're looking at them from above. Okay, and but that would still be one layer of floor tiles. This would be if you look at it sideways. Okay, if you look from the side, there's one layer of flat cells. So things like the air sacs of the lungs, here they have to be really thin for oxygen and CO2 to diffuse through. Okay, capillary walls. Capillaries are tiny, tiny blood vessels that are near your body cells, and oxygen from the blood diffuses out of the capillaries to the cells, and then CO2 from the cells diffuses out of them into the blood in the capillaries. So simple cuboidal epithelium. So simple means what? One layer. One layer. Cuboidal is cube-shaped cells. So they're little cubes, like little tiny dice. Or die, I think it's plural. And then epithelial tissue. So one layer of cube-shaped cells, simple cuboidal epithelium. They're located in the kidney tubules and in small ducts and glands. That's DUCTS, not DUCKS, it's ducts. The major function is absorption and secretion. So you can see here is a kidney tubule. It's a little tiny tube. The kidney has lots of them. And going like all the way around, you'd see the two sides here. Like if you cut a section of maybe a water hose or a big round hollow pasta. But here is like if you cut it and look at it from the top, so you're looking down into it. Here is simple columnar epithelium. So simple, it's still one layer, but columnar, these are column or rectangular shaped cells. They're like little columns, and they're one layer. And notice the one layer reaches all the way from the bottom, which is called the basement membrane, and to the top, which is called the free surface or apical surface. So all the cells go from the top to the bottom. And you can see the nuclei are all at the same level. Sometimes when they're cutting the slide, they'll move them around a little bit, but you can see this row here, they're all at the same level. You don't move them to the same place when you cut them. So location, this is lining the digestive tract from the stomach to the rectum, okay? So starting at the stomach and going through from there to the small intestine, the large intestine, and then the rectum. The major function is absorption and secretion. So you need to have nutrients in the GI tract or in the digestive tract. They're going to be absorbed through this. And then secretion, secreting things like maybe enzymes, digestive enzymes, or here are goblet cells which secrete mucus. And the mucus lines the top of it and makes the surface more slick, so lubricates it. So other features, so goblet cells secrete mucus. They might also have cilia, which you learned about cilia before. Remember the little hair-like structures that move things? And then microvilli are little finger-like structures that help increase absorption. So simple columnar epithelium, one layer, rectangular cells. and line the digestive tract from the stomach through the rectum. Stratified squamous epithelium. Look at this. Before, all of the words were simple, which was all one layer. Here's stratified. Stratified means many layers. So if you've ever learned about geology, or maybe you've seen where they cut through a little mountain or hill to put a road there, and you can see different layers, and they call those layers the strata, or layers of the earth. So here, these are layers, many layers. And this is squamous, so again, they're flat. We had squamous before. And epithelium. This is located in areas subject to wear and tear. So the outer layer of the skin, which is the epidermis of the skin, and also lining the nose, the mouth, the esophagus, the anal canal, and the vagina. So all of these areas here are subject to wear and tear. If you think of the outer layer of your skin, of course you want more than one layer there. If you only had one layer, then, and you had maybe you'd take off your sweater and there would go your skin with it. And you'd be like, oh, what happened to my skin, my epidermis? It's over in my sweater. Oh no. But you have many, many layers. So also, if you think about when you're eating, every time you eat, those epithelial cells inside your mouth are going to be coming off. Oh, do you remember the cheek cell slide that you did? You did a cheek cell smear with methylene blue, and all you did was rub a little bit of a spoon on the inside of your mouth. It probably got all of these cheek cells. So if you just had one layer, every time you ate food, there'd go the whole lining of your mouth. So you have many layers. Major function: protection from abrasion, so things rubbing against it, protection from pathogen, protection from drying out, and then also protection from water gain. Because if you didn't have these thick layers and then you go and maybe take a bath, and then with osmosis, all the water would move into you. And then you'd be shaped like a bathtub. You couldn't get out. You'd have to get out after a bath and then dry all the water out of you. So for desiccation, if you think of, if you've ever spilt a little piece of meat on the cabinet, or on the, not the cabinet, the countertop, and you find it an hour or two later and it's this dried up, nasty little piece of meat. So we have our skin to cover us up so we won't dry up like that. But pathogens, so we won't have bacteria all, I mean, they have to get through the skin to get to the rest of us. Here is pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So columnar, they're going to be column shaped. And then pseudo-stratified. Stratified is layers, but pseudo means false. So this is one layer of rectangular cells that looks like many layers. So remember before we had simple columnar epithelium, which is one layer of rectangular cells, and then they had the nuclei all at one level. But here with pseudostratified columnar epithelium, all of the cells will touch the basement membrane, but they all don't reach the free surface. So that means it makes their nuclei be at all different levels, and it makes it look like many layers, but it's really just one. This type of tissue lines the trachea or windpipe, and then it lines the rest of your upper respiratory system. The major function is secretion of mucus. So see right here the goblet cells secreting mucus. And see the little cilia here? The mucus, what will happen is when you breathe air, then the air is going to go into your trachea and into your bronchi and your bronchioles. And then it's going to have this layer of mucus. And the dust in the air that you breathe is going to get trapped in that mucus, hopefully. And then the cilia are going to just sweep all that dusty, dirty mucus upward. And then when you later cough, you might hawk up a loogie, or you might cough up some mucus. Then that is that dusty, dirty mucus from your respiratory tract that your cilia were just sweeping up. Okay. So your goblet cells producing mucus. I think they look like upside down wine goblets. So just imagine a wine goblet filled with mucus, and that will remind you goblet cells produce mucus. Here is transitional epithelium. And for transitional, that means the cells can change shape. So when this tissue is really, really flat, then the cells are going to be stretched out and they're going to look like they're squamous. So it'll look like more of stratified squamous. But when they're not stretched out, the cells will look cuboidal or even maybe columnar. So the location is the urinary bladder. So you think of the urinary bladder, after you empty it, the cells will not be stretched and they'll look like this, okay? But as you sit there and your kidneys filter your blood and produce more and more urine, and the urine fills up your bladder and your bladder will stretch more and more, then the cells are going to look more flat. The major function of transitional epithelium is stretch. I just remember the cells are in transition between one shape to another, so transitional, and they can stretch. This allows the urinary bladder to stretch so it can hold more urine as it's being produced. If our urinary bladder didn't have the ability to stretch, just imagine what would happen. I mean, you would either have to have some type of catheter with a bag collecting urine strapped to your leg all the time, or maybe all of the desk chairs would have to have holes in them, or everyone would walk around with wet pants. Oh, that'd be awful. So anyway, luckily our urinary bladder has this ability to stretch so it can hold more urine as it's being produced and store it till we have time to get rid of it and to place. Our next category of tissues is connective tissue. This is the most abundant and widely distributed of the 4 major tissue types. They're extremely variable and there's a lot of different types. The major functions of connective tissue are binding and support, protection, insulation, storing reserve fuel, and transporting substances, so like the blood. If you think of storing, you're thinking of fat or adipose tissue. Transporting the blood. Insulation, adipose tissue. Protection, adipose tissue. Areolar connective tissue, and then for binding and support, there's a lot of different connective tissues. Characteristics of connective tissue, there's varying degrees of vascularity. So some of them have a really good blood supply, but some of them do not. Certainly blood would have a good blood supply, right? But cartilage doesn't have that great of a blood supply. Bone has a really good blood supply. Another characteristic is there is an extracellular matrix. Now look at the word extra, means outside, cellular, the cell. So there's going to be non-living material outside of the cells, between the cells in connective tissues. So remember, your epithelial tissues were right up next to each other like bricks or tiles. But these connective tissues, some of the cells are going to be spread far apart, and so forth. So 3 main parts of connective tissue are the ground substance, the protein fibers, and the cells. And this picture here is just a typical sort of connective tissue. This is actually an areolar connective tissue, which is a loose connective tissue that shows a lot of different things in it. The ground substance is the material in the extracellular matrix that fills spaces and contains fibers. So here's cells here. Here's some white blood cells here and here. Here's fibroblasts that are making fibers, fibroblast. Here's some fat cells, adipose cells. And here's a macrophage, a big eater, that's an immune cell. And right here here's a big, thick fiber, collagen fiber, an elastin fiber, and a reticular fiber here. So the ground substance, everything between the cells, and We just looked at the protein fibers, but collagen fibers, these are extremely tough white protein fibers. So right here, they're very tough and they're white and they're protein and they're the biggest fibers of the three types. So you'll see them a lot in tendons and ligaments. So if you think about if you eat chicken and you've ever bought a drumstick, then you'll see a piece of meat connected to this rubbery white thing that holds it to the bone. Okay, and that is going to be a tendon, okay, and it's white, so lots of collagen fibers make it that way. Collagen fibers are the most abundant protein fibers. Then there's elastic fibers, and these are protein fibers that allow for stretch and recoil. So right here, the elastic fibers here. And then reticular fibers are short, fine, highly branched collagenous fibers that form nets. So the little bitty fine ones here, I think of them like a little 3D hairnet. Those are reticular fibers. Then the cells. So we had the ground substance, the protein fibers, and here's the cells. So if you hear the word blast, that means it secretes ground substance and fibers. And just think blast builds. So blast builds. And you might see a fibroblast, you might see an osteoblast or a chondroblast. Then sites will maintain the matrix, like an osteocyte or, oh, here's a lymphocyte, but a fibrocyte. And then mast cells and macrophages are immune cells. So here's a mast cell, and macrophages, that means big eater. Macro is big and phage is eater. So these go around and eat things that shouldn't be here. So here are your types of connective tissues. And a lot of times I write CT for connective tissues, it's capital, just because I don't want to just write connective tissue 1,000 times. So, or even maybe say it 1,000 times. But anyway, here's connective tissue. So the first one here is areolar connective tissue, and that is a loose fibrous connective tissue with widely spaced cells and loosely arranged fibers. So this was our basic example. By the way, it's areolar. It's very airy, so areolar. That's how I remember it. It has all three types of protein fibers. It has a jelly-like substance between the cells and fibers. And areolar connective tissue surrounds and connects organs and acts as packing material. I think of it sort of like bubble wrap, but I know where the leg meets the torso, there's a little bit of this, and it just looks clear, jelly-like, at least in a cat dissection, and with little springy fibers. So adipose tissue, this is fat. So anytime if you've seen bacon, the white part or the white part around the steak, that's adipose tissue or fat. This is for insulation, energy storage, and protection. This is also a loose connective tissue, and it has cells called adipocytes, and they are cells that are filled with triglycerides. And triglycerides, those are glycerol with 3 fatty acids. So when they check your blood, sometimes you'll hear triglycerides. Then they're looking for that. But the adipose tissue, the cells are filled with triglycerides. And they're so filled with fat that actually the organelles, and here's the nuclei, are kind of smashed out to the side. And the adipocytes are close together. So a lot of this is located like beneath the skin, behind the eyes, to keep the eyes from banging around. The kidneys are embedded in fat, and in the yellow bone marrow. Reticular connective tissue. Remember, reticular means like the reticular fibers, and those were the little fine fibers that formed like a 3D hairnet, and these provide a framework for organs. So the protein fibers are all reticular fibers. They're located in the lymph nodes, spleen, liver, and bone marrow. So if you've ever seen bone marrow, again, if you had the chicken drumstick, I'll tell you, if you go and buy a chicken drumstick, you can see a lot of different tissues on it, and and look at them all. But if you break open the bone and you see the bone marrow, then you'll see that. Also, if you've ever like cooked or eaten liver, you'll notice a lot of this tissue, the organs that have reticular connective tissue, they're all sort of like maybe grainy with springy fibers in it because they're reticular fibers. And these cells are reticulocytes. The next one, elastic connective tissue. So this here is a tissue that has a lot of elastic fibers or elastin fibers, and they're these wiggly fibers here that we looked at before, and what they do is allow the tissue to recoil after it's stretched. So this is really important for some tissues that if they stretch out, then you want them to be able to spring back to their original shape. So the walls of the large arteries, like the aorta, and also the bronchial tube. So like the aorta is going to suddenly get a big surge of blood from the heart every time the heart beats. And it's going to have to stretch out to receive that big bunch of blood, and then it's going to have to recoil. So you'll see a lot of elastin fibers or elastic fibers will be in there. And they always stain black using whatever stain they're using. They look wiggly black fibers. So here's dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. I think these ones in the elastic tissue go together sort of because you have fibers are tightly packed. But for the dense, these ones are even more tightly packed because they're dense and both dense. But what it is in the dense regular and dense irregular connective tissue is they're tightly packed collagen fibers. So they're the thicker fibers. Now look at the difference for dense regular connective tissue. The collagen fibers run all the same direction. They're all parallel to each other. So this would be, it would be very strong if you pulled from here to here and you stretched out that tissue. It would be very, very strong. But if you pulled here from the top to the bottom, those fibers would easily split apart, so that whole tissue would split apart. This would be found in the tendons and ligaments. So this would be the part from the chicken meat on the drumstick that's holding the meat to the bone, the little white part, because collagen's a white muscle fiber. So here's dense irregular connective tissue. The collagen fibers are very tightly packed together, but they are in an irregular arrangement. They're not all the same direction. So this, the dermis of the skin in your joint capsules also, and forming the coverings around some organs. Now one place where I don't have here is this is found in the sclera or the white of the eye. Now if you look at the eye, you'll notice it is white, and that's because the collagen is white, and it's densely packed collagen fibers. And it's also very, very tough. If you've ever dissected a cow eye, you'll know it's really, really hard to get through the sclera. So cartilage is our next type of connective tissue, and there's actually three kinds of cartilage. Cartilage is a supportive connective tissue, and it's part of the skeletal system. Chondrocytes are going to be cartilage cells. So I'm thinking, if you heard of chondrichthyes, they're cartilaginous fish, but you're probably not thinking of those. There's another, glucosamine chondroitin. A lot of people take that as a supplement for their cartilage. But chondrocytes, remember cartilage cells. Anytime you see the word chondro, think cartilage. These are, chondrocytes are located in spaces called lacunae, okay? So here's the chondrocytes, so little cells, and they're located in the lacunae. I think Gilligan's Island had a laguna. Chondrocytes live in a laguna. singular lacuna, plural lacunae. And here's the matrix all between them. Cartilage has a very poor blood supply, so it heals slowly and usually not fully. So if you've ever damaged your cartilage before, you probably know that it's usually not going to be the same. So there are three kinds of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage, the rib cartilages, or costal cartilage, the ends of your long bones and your joints. And then there is actually the larynx right here, and the trachea and bronchioles. There's little hyaline cartilage rings. Elastic cartilage, this is interesting cartilage that can bounce back to its original shape. So that's in the ear and in the epiglottis. And then fibrocartilage, the intervertebral disc and the pubic symphysis, this little pad of cartilage in the pubic area between the two hip bones. So that's your three major kinds of cartilage. Your hyaline cartilage is flexible, rigid tissue that appears glassy. It's very, very smooth. It has very fine collagen fibers in the matrix that you can't even see with a stain. Hyaline cartilage reduces friction in joints. The location is the ends of bones, the tracheal rings, the larynx, rib cartilages, the nose, and the embryonic skeleton. So this on the chicken drumstick, the really shiny, whitish tissue that's on the ends of the bone that you'll see, it looks almost like plastic. That is hyaline cartilage. And this needs to be really smooth on the ends of joints because it helps them to, the bones to move against each other, but without friction. Elastic cartilage contains a lot of elastin fibers, okay, but you can tell it's elastic cartilage and not elastic tissue because it has chondrocytes in the lacunae, and then between it, it has all these elastin fibers. There might be elastic tissue on either side. So this has strength and ability to stretch and go back to the original position, and this is external ear and epiglottis. So if you think about it, if your ears did not have this ability to stretch and recoil back to the original position, every morning you'd have to wake up and fix your ears into whatever position they needed to be. I mean, it might be neat with Halloween, maybe put little points on top, but you know, other than that, you'd have your ears messed up every morning. So fibrocartilage, this is compressible cartilage and it resists tension. And a location is the intervertebral disc and the pubic symphysis and the knee menisci. So if someone says, oh, I have a torn meniscus, they're talking about a fibrocartilage pad in the knee. And that's real important because you have a lot of weight going on that joint, the knee joint. And then between your vertebrae, you have intervertebral disc and they compress. If you take your height, especially as you get older, but if you go and measure your height first thing in the morning and then measure it at night, if you've been standing a lot all day, you'll be a little shorter, like measurably different in the evening. So here's the locations again. Hyaline cartilage in the blue, the elastic cartilage in the green, and the fibrocartilage in the red. So here, the knee meniscus and the menisci. Now we have bone. Bone is an extremely hard connective tissue with a solid matrix. It supports and protects body structure and is involved in movements. Cavities in bones are the site of blood cell production as well as storage sites for fat. Osteocytes are the bone cells. So remember, chondrocytes were the cartilage cells. Osteocytes, think osteoporosis, bone cells. And then the fibrocytes were the cells in the tissues that had like dense, irregular connective tissue and so forth. So here's an osteocyte right here. Here's osteoblast, which build bone. And here is going to be compact bone. And notice the little bone cells here the osteocytes, they are in lacunae as well. So each one is in a little lacuna. Bone has a very good blood supply. So a lot of people who have bone fractures, they'll heal better than cartilage injuries. So compact bone, there's two types of bone. Compact bone is located in the shafts of the bones and then the outside of all the bones. So the shafts of the long bones, like your arm and leg bones, but then the outsides of all bones. So you have a flat bone here, has compact bone on the outside. This might be in the skull. And then spongy bone is located in the ends of the long bones right here. Here's some spongy bone here, and here's compact bone here. Here's spongy bone here, or in the middle here, spongy bone. And here's compact bone. Compact bone, it's strong and looks like tree trunks, so strong like trees. And spongy bone is right here, you have little plates called trabeculae. Either way, you have the osteocytes are in spaces called lacunae. And our last tissue is blood, and this is the only fluid connective tissue, is blood, the only fluid tissue. But it is a tissue. It consists of blood cells surrounded by the non-living fluid matrix plasma. So here's the plasma, here's red blood cells here. Here's white blood cells here, and then here's some platelets. So cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And there's plasma between it, which is water and a bunch of other things dissolved in it. So blood functions in transport and homeostasis. So the transport of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, waste, hormones, electrolytes, all sorts of different things. The location of blood is in the blood vessels. So nervous tissues, there's only one type of nervous tissue in this whole category. So nervous tissue controls the body. It's responsible for coordinating and controlling many body activities. The location of nervous tissue is in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. There are two major cell types in nervous tissue. There's neurons, and here's a neuron right here. So you can see you've got this major cell, here's some neurons here. The neurons are actually specialized nerve cells that generate and conduct nerve impulses. So when I think of a nerve impulse, then I think of electricity going along an electric line. So just think of it's like a chemical electrical signal that the neuron can generate and then send down this electric line. Here's the electric line, and send it down there. So neuroglia are just all these other little cells in the background, little cells all around in the background that are little small. Those are the neuroglia. So just to let you know, the difference in color here is just different stain used. This is probably done, it's called H&E, hematoxylin and eosin, but you get pink and blues. This right here is definitely a silver stain. So it's actually silver, and you know how silver tarnishes and turns brown? That's why you have this brown look from the tarnish. So nervous tissue is located in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Now muscle tissue, there's three kinds of muscle tissue, but muscle tissues are cells that are capable of contracting to produce movement. There's skeletal muscle, which by the way, skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton. It's attached to the bones. Skeletal muscle produces movement of the body and body parts, so movements of the arms, the legs, all of that. The muscle cells are long, cylindrical, and striated multinucleate cells. So cylindrical, they're shaped like long straws or like a long piece of yarn. Striated means they're striped, so you can see the little striations or stripes. And then multinucleate means more than one nucleus per cell. So these cells might run the whole length of one of your muscles. And it might have just hundreds of nuclei in it. Because it's such a long cell, it's going to need a lot of nuclei. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. That means you control it. You volunteer to do what you want to with your skeletal muscle. So you control it. If you decide you want to bend your elbow, bend your arm at the elbow, then you can do it. Because your biceps brachii, which is in your upper arm, is going to contract and shorten, and it's going to pull on your lower arm, but you control that. So attached to the skeleton, skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle. Cardiac, heart, right? So it's in the heart. Cardiac muscle causes the heart to beat, and it causes the heart to pump blood. So basically, when cardiac muscle cells contract, they shorten and they squeeze the heart. And the middle layer of the heart is cardiac muscle, the whole heart wall. The cells are striated, see they're striped. They're branching though, the cells branch here, and they have one nucleus per cell. You can see here's the where the cell starts and ends, so that's one cell, one nucleus. This little extra dark stripe between the cells, all of these are called intercalated discs. And they're junctions between cardiac cells that allow the ions to flow freely from cell to cell. That way the whole area of heart wall can contract in one smooth movement instead of just the individual cells, because they have little gaps in here called gap junctions, little holes, proteins, and those will allow ions to flow through. Cardiac muscle is involuntary. You don't control it. You can't just sit there and make your heart squeeze just by thinking, heart squeeze now, right? So it's involuntary, in location in the heart wall. I believe this is our last tissue. Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, it's called smooth muscle because the cells are smooth. There's no striations, no stripes, so it looks smooth. Smooth muscle moves substances through organs and passageways. So it's in the walls of the stomach and the walls of the small and large intestines. Smooth muscle helps with mechanical digestion of food. It helps your stomach squeeze the food to break it up into, well, to grind it into and mix it into a paste called chyme. And then you have the same thing going on in your intestines. Your small intestines are squeezing the food. The structure of the cells are spindle shaped. That just means they're narrow at both ends. They're long cells with narrowed ends. They have one nucleus per cell. They are not striated, not striped. They appear smooth, and the cells are going to be in sheets. Like you'll have a whole sheet in the stomach wall, making a whole wall of the stomach. This is involuntary. You can't make your stomach wall squeeze whenever and wherever you want it to. It does it on its own. Location, the walls of the hollow organs, the GI tract or digestive tract. That means gastrointestinal tract is the same thing as digestive tract. Also, smooth muscle is in the walls of your blood vessels and your lymph vessels. So here are tissues in the body. This is an arm, for example, and you have epithelial tissue lining the surface, the epidermis of the skin. There is skeletal muscle here in the biceps brachii attached to bones, to the skeleton. There's also going to be some smooth muscle, it's just not in the walls of the blood vessels. There's nervous tissue in the nerves. There's blood is inside the blood vessels. There's going to be hyaline cartilage on the end of the bones, ends of the bones. There's compact bone on the outside of the bones and the shafts. There's spongy bone inside the ends of the bones. Oh, and here is some loose connective tissue. There's loose connective tissue that's going to be in part of the dermis, the other part of the skin. Like there's the epidermis on the outside and then the dermis below that. So that'll have some loose connective tissue, areolar connective tissue. So those were the tissues. Remember, organs are complex structures made up of two or more tissues working together to perform a specific function. So your brain is an organ. There's going to be nervous tissue, there's connective tissue, there's blood vessels going in there, so there's going to be blood, and there's going to be muscle and the smooth muscle and the blood vessel lining. So here's a heart, the heart right here, the stomach here. You know, it always would help to get a picture of the human body with the organs labeled and look at it. And then that way, here's the liver, and then you can sort of start remembering where everything is. There's a thyroid up here. The thymus is down here. It doesn't show though. The urinary bladder. I always like to call this urinary bladder because the gallbladder is up under the liver. These kidneys right here, they should actually be more toward the back. I guess they wouldn't show, but they should be dorsal or posterior to these other organs. So maybe I'll look for a different slide. And oh my goodness, that is it. That is it. Oh, that was a long time. Anyway, so this is the first lecture of the human anatomy and physiology section. In the second lecture and portion of the notes, then we'll go through the systems one by one. So if you have any questions, email me, and I believe that's it. Thank you. Have a good night. And yeah, email me with any questions. Bye.